Okay, hope you're all awake after lunch, not going into a food coma, because I'm going to have to speed through quite a lot here. This is a quite technical presentation, to squeeze into half an hour. I'm going to start with the bad news first on some difficulties we may face on transitioning into a renewable energy economy, and finish on more positive notes of things that we can do to adapt our communities and help speed along this transition. And if you're the kind of person who might want to take pictures of something in case you forget it, don't worry, I'm going to have a link right at the end to all my notes. You'll be able to check in detail the things I've been talking about, so I may be skimming over a few points. A lot of what this presentation is based on is a couple of free books you can find and read for free online. The first one, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, by the late Dr. David Mackay from Cambridge University, looked at the UK's economy as sort of a case study of whether we can meet all of our needs of energy with just the renewable potentials that we have for this island. And while it's not as applicable to the whole globe, it's very useful for looking at how useful some of these technologies are. And the second book, Our Renewable Future, from just a couple of years ago by a couple of guys from the Post-Carbon Institute, takes a more global look at our economy and some big barriers in how fast we can implement putting renewables in place. So I want to give you a quick look at sort of the state of our current economy. And if you've ever seen some of the artwork that's come out of the Zeitgeist Movement, you may well have seen this picture. Gives sort of a feeling for our industrial excess, the way we spoil the planet, but it's not a real thing. I'd like to give you more a realistic look at what's actually going on out there, because we don't have this gigantic, monstrous machine towering over us every day. So I found this picture of a gigantic, monstrous machine towering over us. And I'd like to ask you, in this age of easy photo manipulation, put your hand up if you think this is fakery, some Photoshop, or it's a few there, or say CGI for a movie, something like that. We've got maybe 10 to 20%. I'm going to give you some bad news. It's real, and this is the largest land vehicle that man has ever created. It's one of a few called bucket excavator machines. They're used for strip mining away soil to get at coal beds under the earth. They're fed by grid electricity. But then, of course, if you're using energy to get down at something under the ground, to get energy out then to burn, to turn into energy, they must be getting more out than they're getting in, a concept I'll come back to in a minute. When you see scenes of devastation like that, and I'm sure we've all seen the oil sands in Canada, and you compare it to the kind of impact you get with putting renewable systems in place, it makes it kind of hard to sympathize with groups like these guys who unfortunately have to live around and deal with, interact with. But they have seized on one true little point embedded within this big picture, is that electricity costs and fuel poverty are rising, but it's not because of wind turbines going in place, which are actually one of the cheapest ways historically to supply renewable energy and of any energy. I'll come back to why it's going up in a few minutes, and more on the scale. The way you ship things around the world is a bit crazy at the moment. It's just a shipping ships. But this is also a real picture of one of our biggest movers at sea, able to take oil rigs out to sea where they're needed, or you could bring marine wind turbines out with this sort of thing. But all our cargo ships, smaller than this and this one, almost all of them depend on oil as a fuel. As with our trucks and our airplanes, to bring everything to us from food, medicine, any goods that we get. If we are running out of oil, that could be a big problem for us. And if you look at the way, say, Cuba and North Korea were impacted when the Soviet Union collapsed and they had their oil imports cut, you can see the kind of chaos that can create. So how much energy are we actually using in all this scale? You can see here a few different transitions have already occurred in our energy economy, when before we used to rely a lot on wood before we discovered coal. and then mixed in oil and gas in the mixture there. And it's, you can see, grown enormously in the last 150 years, but you may wonder, well, our population has increased a lot as well in that time, so has it gone up per person? And you may be surprised when you look at the per person energy usage, there's also been an explosion in how much we use. For in the last 50 years, it's probably well aware, the post-war periods when consumerism and advertising really took off. There's an oft-quoted statistic, for instance, in Story of Stuff, that the US's consumption of resources roughly doubled in that time, and yet their happiness just decreased, didn't go anywhere up along with the resource use. And so also you might not be able to see clearly what's going on with oil in there sandwiched in between other resources, so you've got to wonder, has peak oil happened, or is it happening or going to happen? Well, in most of the oil producing countries in the world, it's already a matter of history. Peak oil has happened in most places. This doesn't include the biggest ones such as Saudi Arabia, who have still continued managing to increase their consumption. But there has been a bit of skepticism around whether it's going to be a problem anytime soon, coming from one particular country recently, which was the USA, since they developed hydraulic fracturing, which allowed their oil production, which had peaked and was going down, and all their conventional wells are continuing to follow that curve. They've had a sudden boom in fracking, but if you check out a recent TEDx lecture at Fintorn by a retired geologist by the name of Dr. David Smythe, he was showing that the fracking industry in the US hasn't actually managed to turn a profit on what they've sold. You know, they could barely compete in the market and have run up debts. The costs plus debt amounting to about twice what they've sold their oil for, so there could be a big bubble crash in that market pending quite soon. And with those small oil wells peaking really quickly, that little bit may peak very soon, and it might not be a technology that can be imported to Britain, no matter how much the Conservative Party want it. So, what is a peak in any given resource? Well, when our ancestors were roaming the planet, they may well have found what is called native gold, silver, and copper ores that were readily available, metals that didn't need to be taken out of ores, and there were high quality resources to be found in some places, but they would have been whipped up quite quickly by any organized community. And as civilization developed, you know, all the easy to get resources of any kind were used first, obviously, and then we're down to things that you have to move a lot of rock just to get at what you want to extract. And so what a peak is when the increasing difficulty of accessing resource under the ground is increasing faster than your technology to make it easier to extract and keep up with it. So you can't increase your rate of production anymore. And the more you push trying to extract it faster, the sharper the downfall is going to be at the end. And there's been another good book about this recently, Scarcity by Christopher Clugston, looking sort of as a case study of what our resource scarcity looks like around the world. That there are many resources under the ground in close to critical scarcity, or imagine, for instance, if we suffered a shortage of what we needed to create concrete for the bases of wind turbines, or say any of the rare elements needed in solar photovoltaic panels, we could be in quite dire straits. There's a bit of this also addressed in the Zeitgeist Movement, defined in a few pages there, a bit more briefly, that you can read. And the usual challenges that are raised to having a renewable energy economy, as I've already mentioned, were about where you can put things and people having resistance to something in their backyard. Also, the amount of consumption that we already have and the way the economic system wants to keep growing demand, where we might be in a declining energy scenario, of course, well-known the intermittency, as in how unreliable wind power is. And the one I want to talk about most of all is the least talked about, is how much energy actually goes into constructing new systems. So if we ask, can we live on our renewables, this was the sort of climax of the book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, stacking up our current consumption and, say, the renewable potentials that we have for the UK. And it looks a bit grim that if we tried to live on our renewables here today with our huge consumption, some of this is not often included, is the energy that goes into the stuff that we make, or that people are making for us and gets shipped over to us. And so we would end up being net importers of energy in that kind of scenario. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the globe would be that way, but it's more an indictment of our over-consuming, overpopulated little haven that we have here for the rich. And it shows that, for instance, in our transportation system, our heating, and our ridiculous overconsumption, there are great savings to be made that could make a renewable future far more possible. The big problem we have is whenever you make something, whether the chairs you're sitting on, this very building, floorboards under our feet, whether you're casting some steel, forming it, ripping up wood into planks, everything has energy put into it in creating material and in forming it in the factory. And there's just some examples from a big database from Bath University looking at how much energy typically goes into what we make things out of. You can see just from a couple of examples here that when we recycle, for instance, aluminium compared to creating out of the ore, we make about a tenfold saving in how much energy goes into doing that. And then right at the bottom, our timber industry, there was, most of these I've included the average values, but there was a huge range that they found in the embodied energy of wood delivered to a factory. And that factor of 20 they found was because of the distance delivering it. When you get wood straight next to some forestry going on, it's one of the best, most easily sustainable materials that we can use. But transport adds a huge energy cost onto it, which can be a problem on how remotely we want to make something. And all of this feeds into a concept called the energy return on energy invested. So whether you're drilling a well, which is a very messy business, to, say, get geothermal power or oil out of the ground, or whether you're making solar panels out of silica and some rare elements, you're going to put a lot of energy investment into getting it going. Now, the way it's been historically with oil, they would get a lot of energy right at the start and it would gradually increase, but the situation we have with renewables tends to be we put a lot more energy in right at the start and then it's very constant there onwards. The system lasts for much longer. However, there was, because we've been trying to grow our use of renewables, there's quite a worrying study from Stanford University in 2013. They looked at all the photovoltaic panels that have been installed in the world so far and looking at whether they were putting energy into the economy. And they found that up till 2010, all of our solar installed capacity had been a net sink of energy because the older panels, so inefficient, had such a long payback time, and because we were trying to make them as quickly as we could, they weren't putting energy in. It was more of an investment in the future. That doesn't mean that they don't pay off eventually. They do have a return on energy, but it's a problem if we need to grow the use of something like that very quickly. There will be a limit to how fast we can build, say, PV panels. Otherwise, we need to find other places to save energy in order to make them. And the next bit, intermittency, is pretty self-explanatory. I won't have to go over that. It's just, you know, the day and night cycle, that sort of thing. This is what it looks like when it actually hits the grid. This is the solar and wind input to the German power grid in 2013. And you can see the very obvious thing that in the middle of summer you get plenty of solar power. It's a great thing if you're somewhere warm and you want cooling. It's not so useful if you're in a cold temperate place like here and you need heating in winter. And it almost looks like the wind power makes up for that, since you get a fair bit more during winter. But when you go down to the weekly and daily, you can see there can be problems when there are lulls of a couple of weeks. Say if you have no wind for a while, and in that case we really need some storage to have energy, to be heating during winter. And while there are some great solutions to this, many being developed, our cheapest so far being pumping water up and downhill. We've possibly reached about half of our capacity that we can install on the globe of pumped hydro. It depends who you ask on which areas are feasible. But there are other ways that we can also adapt to a fluctuating energy supply. Say if we have grid connected and timed appliances, say in heating, not so much of the ridiculous Internet of Things of connecting your toaster to the internet to know when it's done or something, but more very practical of saving yourself money on big things like heating. And if we can get that connected to some types of industry where if they can slow down or speed up production when the wind is blowing or not, there are only so many industries that can do that, but if tariffs can be available for them to save money, that's what we need to incentivize that kind of thing going on. And you may hear sometimes that a particular country is getting almost all of its, say, electricity in the form of renewable power. And you wonder, are they already there? Are they completely self-sufficient? But there's a bit of bad news on that also, that globally we only get about 19–20% globally of our energy in the form of electricity. This is the US, where they get about 21%. In poorer countries it would be less because they would have less electric grid rolled out. So not only do we need to replace all of our electricity supply with renewable sources, but we need to have 5 times as much of our electricity supply in the form of some kind of renewable energy in order to supply all our current needs. Otherwise, we need to find a way to decrease our consumption of energy to make that easier. And I give a few very quick examples, a few tastes of some examples from those books of problems we'll run into. For instance, in creating metals, as you saw earlier, you need very high temperatures to be smelting metals or, say, creating concrete. And we can get some of our energy for systems like these, say, from solar collectors, but these can only be put in some places in the world. There are very few of them. And there are some systems that won't allow fluctuating supply. And so we can do things, say, with charcoal or biogas, but that would then compete with our needs to balance the grid itself with those kinds of storage. So we need to find more ways of getting energy storage in that way. Say, as Adam Drage was saying earlier, if we can reduce our meat consumption, we could have more land to produce, have forestry going on and get charcoal from that as a sustainable fuel to use in high temperature applications and balance our grid out at the same time. Here's a look at transport. This is a graph of how much energy you can fit per weight and size into something. The things on the left-hand side are things that would be too heavy to fit in fly a plane with, at least one that was carrying many passengers or cargo. And the things down the bottom would take up far too much space in a truck, or would need you to have a much bigger vehicle. So we're looking at a situation where we need a lot of investment in infrastructure that can, for instance, trains be more easily linked into our grid and be a bit more efficient. But there's still something missing here, way off the graph, but I like this picture to give a better idea of the difference here. You see, you may wonder why I bring this up in transport, that uranium used in a nuclear reactor has, say, 1,000,000 to 1 difference in how much energy it delivers compared to petrol in a car. Well, there are already uses of nuclear power out there in transport. When you think of it at sea, you might think of, say, nuclear submarines, and even then the missile systems and not the reactors running them, but there are already some ships out there running on nuclear power. These are, for instance, on the bottom left, icebreakers running around the Arctic, allowing some of those cargo ships to get through during the winter. But we've got into such a situation with the ice thinning on the polar ice caps recently, that just this last winter was the first time a ship was able to make a delivery through Arctic ice without an icebreaker in front of it, just a regular ship, much stronger than Titanic. But fortunately, there are renewable systems that we can put in place for our shipping. Not quite the tall ships of the traditional age of sail, but these systems, for instance, rotor ships and kite ships, they're much more easy to automate, but the trouble is these proofs of concept have only been used as fuel saving with otherwise a conventional diesel oil motor. And if we want to have still things shipped around the globe, then we'll need to accept that things may take longer to get there until we have some other, greater renewable sources and ways of keeping things going for a long distance at sea. Otherwise, if consumption is going to keep increasing, you may well see an increase in those nuclear-powered ships going about as oil is running out. And last of all, one of the most important problems already raised is a trouble with agriculture, that the way we're using our lands now, having a lot of flat plains and pollution and land running off, destroying the soil by having it just wash away into rivers. We need to be using different methods, whether permacultural methods on the land or localizing our production in, say, hydroponic greenhouses locally, but that will take a lot of energy input, a lot of investment just to set up greenhouses, all the glass and infrastructure involved. And you can see that in our current, well, this is the US food system, they have about 7 calories of fossil fuel energy going into each calorie of foods, although a calorie is not necessarily a great measure of the nutrition of a food. Still, there has been some improvement there in that we're saving some by refrigeration, and in some ways some of our food production has become more efficient, but still we know that we're wasting a lot that's not going to poor regions because of the way our economy is structured. So you've got to wonder, at the end of the day, how much are we wasting? I'm sure you've heard plenty of statistics from charities going on about this every day. I just mentioned a couple for examples. That say, of all the plastic we go through and throw away worldwide, still only 9% of our plastic waste is being recycled worldwide after creating 8.3 billion tons of it. 6.3 billion has ended up as waste. Only 16% of our electrical waste is being recycled after such a great legal push to force collectors and the people creating it to support the recycling of electronics. And clearly we have quite a hoarding culture going on, and we have 1.2 billion cars or road vehicles on our roads in the world. I was thinking of putting up a parking lot to illustrate that on how much we waste, but it's a bit disingenuous because at the end of the day they are used at some point 2 times a day to go to work and get back again. So although it's been found that one car put into a car share scheme, not Uber but actual car sharing, tends to liberate about 15 cars from the roads. And that doesn't really help commuters. What we really need there is a bigger, more integrated public transport system that will get people to and fro and not have so much focus on roads, which we may not be able to use anymore with even just the requirement of oil going into rubber for the tires. And I was going to have a quick intermission, but unfortunately won't have time for it. I'm going to move on to part 2, which is named after a little article that I'll get to in a second. We've got a situation at the moment where our resource consumption, you've probably heard, is in overshoot. Last year, Earth Overshoot Day, the day when we'd used up all the resources that Earth can renew, was 2nd of August. It gets closer every day, and our debt-based money system keeps forcing people within this economy to try and grow, and economists want to hear nothing of the growing. And of course, there are 2 aspects of problem here: the population growth and how much we use per person. Best way to slow population growth, if you haven't heard about the demographic transition theories, reducing our death rate by defeating disease, and this has happened a lot faster in countries recently than it originally happened when we defeated disease here when we first industrialized. So there's a bit of good news there, but we need to get down to a stage where our resource consumption is not growing, and we need to find a steady state economy somewhere below our current level. One of the best ways that we can lower our consumption would be on the demand side. So our best system would be, say, a tool or toy library, so you can save money and resources, and if we all pile into getting only the few best pieces of equipment instead of following the pattern of everybody having one each and it all being junk that no tradesman would ever use because they know it'll break, we'll be able to have much lower consumption. And here's where the name for this second part comes from. This was from sort of the white paper that started the RepRap, or Replicating Rapid Prototype project, by Dr. Adrian Boyer from Bath University, looking at self-replicating robots as a way of producing, where before John von Neumann's concept of a universal constructor, wherever it was attempted to be implemented, looked at something that's assembled itself, whereas instead this project looked at something that would produce useful products, but people would have to assemble it. And this project managed to bring the cost of 3D printers from tens of thousands of pounds down to hundreds of pounds. And Adrian's concept in this was suggesting that it would be a way of reaching the aims of, say, the better aims of socialism, of giving regular people access to advanced means of production, but without the blood and violence that's come with, big revolution of trying to take means of production away from people, and made it so that it would be a self-evolving concept. I've tried to fit this in. This is meant to be sort of a family tree of how these evolved with open source developments, that people took the designs online and made little variations. Now you can't keep track of just how many different varieties of RepRaps there are out there, but I want to pose to you that we now have replicators out there in the world in both senses, of the Star Trek kind that makes something useful, and the Stargate kind where it makes itself. And that's in the form of the way we had programmable computers back in the 40s, that it was the size of a room and it had human components to it. And that would be the Hackerspaces project worldwide, ways of having people come along and share great tools to work on projects together, and they can replicate themselves. And if we can build more of these locally, we can have a local economy to have build things with lower consumption of resources. And there are a set of tools, for instance, that can help you to create these. It was said by David Gingery, writing a set of books about making your own metalworking shop back in the 80s, that the only thing you needed to make any other shop in any other tool in the workshop was a lathe. That was quite the case, and that was talking about making just a little charcoal-fired aluminium recycling furnace. That's what the book was about, to make the parts to make a lathe. And you can do that a lot more easily now with a 3D printer. And since we have the open source ecology project with putting up design files for all the kinds of tools you would need for a basic civilization online, it makes it a lot easier. Also made out of metal. And we have this situation in our old recycling industry that we tend to recycle the most valuable bits, say, of electrical parts first. It used to get chucked in other people's shores, but now it tends to go to volunteers around here. We're forced legally to recycle things here, so we have a big problem of excess plastic on our hand. It just so happens that we can use that in 3D printers if we can get to process it. It's an idea I had back just out of university, looking at how we could structure an RBE. I thought back then, if business as usual continued, we would end up doing something called landfill mining, getting valuable resources out of there, and that we should set ourselves up, say, as a recycling center to start a microcosm of an RBE, that you would have people bring resources to you that you could then create things out of. I was delighted to find that there are already some charities doing that kind of thing. It's just a yard out of a charity that's the plastic they collected after taking apart a load of electronics and shipping off the valuable bits, because it was too expensive to have it picked up until they had a giant truckload of it. But thanks to the Precious Plastic Project, similar to open source ecology, there are now quite cheap tools that you can get to recycle plastic locally and create things with. And here's an even more raggedy looking setup where they've managed to get going with second-hand equipment. I don't know if you can guess where that is by all the pockmarks in the ceiling. That's actually a warehouse in the Gaza Strip where, in the hardest of conditions, they have already set up a lab around the corner from there to be creating things locally. And we can also create the 3D printers themselves out of some of the electronic waste that we collect from, say, as you all know, old 2D printers that are poorly made, and even print some parts with the very mud under our feet to make some types of cheap components. And is a great case study of a little charity that takes old things and fixes them up a little bit if they can, or mostly just takes the best and sells it on to the public at low cost. And of course, charity shops do that all across the country already, but they're doing that to feed onto another charity, to some other purpose. And lately, some of them have even started selling, mass-produced tap from China to just slightly increase their profits. Whereas this place, their core purpose is the prevention of waste. And what's special is they're one of only a handful within the whole country that are based on a council recycling point, have a relationship with the council, so they're there just to prevent waste. And I think we need one of these in every town in the country. And if you are worried at all that that's not something very sustainable, looking at their figures, their sales grew by over 250% in the last 5 years. And they're just going from strength to strength with more projects now ongoing using the old materials. And you can find many projects like these near you in your town on shareable.net with the Sharing Cities network. And if there isn't one of these for your town, make one. And it's just a quick one that I like the idea of in London. You might want to check it out. And if you need support to create these kinds of initiatives, you need to find your local transition town, or if you don't have one, again, create one. There's plenty of great media out there to find more about it. I highly recommend Joe Duggan's talk from 2016 with his idea of do-ocracy, that if you want these things done, you can't just be talking about shoulds. You need to get out there and put your effort into making these projects happen. And where there are no grants, you can create your own grant funding body. Here's just an example of a West Scotland community that I identified. They had an unused dam on a wee burn around the corner. They went to the local community in a shares scheme that only local people could invest in. And they quickly managed to get a turbine going in a hut nearby. And I've been told by one of the organisers of this project that they paid their costs off after a couple of years and they're now selling something like 100k worth of electricity every year, and some of that can go into grant funds for local projects. So just to summarise, one of the phrases used by Dr. Moray in his book is, you can't live with the mantra every little helps, it needs to be every big helps. We need to do things that make big differences, so you can't just go around switching things off. We've got to change our lifestyles and help people around us to adapt to a way of lower consumption in ways such as tool libraries, so that we're not constantly going out buying things we don't need. And I just have to cut it off there and maybe take a quick question later, but I think Adam wants to get on. So thank you very much for listening.